What if the crisis of modern life is not that we have too little, but that we're surrounded by too much that doesn't truly nourish us? We live in a world of endless information, endless stimulation, and connection. And yet, so many people feel fragmented, alienated, and cut off from meaning. So today I want to explore this through the archetype of Jupiter, not just as expansion, but as meaningful expansion, and ask whether hyperreality is giving us a false version of growth, a kind of vastness that looks expansive on the surface, but leaves the soul underfed. Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's podcast, I want to explore the archetype of Jupiter through the lens of hyperreality, meaning, and the loss of the real. I want to reflect on something, and it's something I've been contemplating quite deeply with Jupiter going direct. And I want to frame all of this through that archetype of Jupiter. Because when we think about Jupiter in astrology, we often think about growth, abundance, opportunity, expansion, optimism, generosity. What else can I think of? Faith, meaning, and that desire to widen our world. But I've been thinking about Jupiter in a slightly deeper way than that. I've been reflecting on Ren Butler, who wrote The Archetypal Universe. His description of Jupiter as that impulse within us which seeks to grow, to reach out, to broaden our horizons, to embrace wider perspectives and to integrate ourselves into more inclusive wholes. And I think that is such a beautiful way of understanding this archetype because it moves us beyond that kind of really flat idea of Jupiter as simply more, bigger, or luck. And Jupiter is not just about more, it's meaningful more. That's what he's about. It's that impulse in us that wants to grow in a way that brings us greater coherence and participation, which expands our perspective and brings us into a deeper relationship with life as a whole. It's that part of us that wants to study and travel, to explore and learn, to understand and to deepen, trust in life more, and reconnecting with what is true, right, and uplifting. It's the part of us that senses there's something larger than the little story of the little self, and that our lives are somehow asking to participate in that larger reality. So I want to speak about Jupiter today, but I want to place it in conversation with the world we're living in now. The question I've been sitting with is this: what happens when Jupiterian impulses towards expansion get captured by hyper reality? And so the question becomes for me here, what happens when our longing for growth, meaning, transcendence, and participation in something larger gets rerouted into the world of the screen, spectacle, endless information and stimulation, when we are bombarded by millions of images and where we have endless access? So what happens when our hunger for the greater whole, which is natural and Jupiterian, is met by digital vastness instead? Because I think that's very much where we are. We're living in a time that looks incredibly expansive on the surface. We've got more information, access, platforms, millions, billions of opinions, more images and contact, visibility, more stimulation and speed, and definitely more content. And so in that sense, everything feels bigger. It feels louder, wider. It's definitely more immediate. And there's that feeling of more connection, being more connected. And yet, at the same time, I'm aware so many people feel fragmented or alienated. There's a sense of being endlessly manipulated. People are overstimulated and existentially tired. People express a sense of spiritual undernourishment and feeling cut off from meaning. So all of that tells me something important, that not all expansion is truly Jupiterian. Or maybe a better way to say it is that some of what we are experiencing now is a distorted form of Jupiter. It's a kind of inflation, a counterfeit enlargement. It's an expansion of scale without an expansion of our souls. And this is where I think hyperreality becomes very relevant, because hyperreality isn't just about screens in that superficial sense. It's about a condition in which representation, simulation, image, and mediated experience begins to overtake our direct contact with the real. And all experience is mediated through image symbols, but there's a different flavour to this. It's rather than living first and representing later, we increasingly encounter life already shaped through media platforms, definitely through algorithms and digital identities. Life can be shaped through the brand and spectacle and very curated narratives, and now more and more through AI generated language and image as well. So what's so interesting to me is that hyperreality often presents itself in a very Jupiterian language. So it's promising expansion and access, also connection, knowledge to widen our horizon. It certainly promises us limitless possibility, all sorts of expressions of that, and transcendence of old limitations. And it promises us that larger world. And yet so much of it leaves us feeling thinner rather than fuller. And that's the distinction that I keep coming back to as I contemplated it. Because the true archetype of Jupiter doesn't just make life bigger. It makes life more meaningful by widening us into a deeper participation with the whole. Hyperreality, by contrast, often gives us that extension without an integration. And I think that is one of the central spiritual problems of our time, because extension is definitely not the same as growth. We can look at, a wider network. Is that the same as wider consciousness? No. More visibility, that is not the same as more meaning. Someone who's got 1 million viewers, it doesn't guarantee us more meaning. And more information, the accumulation, the digestion of information isn't the same as more wisdom. And having many more options, that is not the same as freedom. And more stimulation isn't awe. It isn't that sense of awe. And if we have access, that does not equate to our sense of belonging or actual belonging. And I think we're really being asked to discern all of that now. Because Jupiter, in his healthiest expression, isn't just about appetite or endless consumption. And definitely, it's not just simply bigness, although it's a huge planet. It's not about scale for its own sake, okay? The heart of Jupiter is expansion of consciousness. That's what the archetype has at its heart. So abundance is not necessarily the scale of abundance. It's about abundance of consciousness, living consciously connected. And it's also about that widening of perspective and deepening of trust. So we might have the growth of generosity and a movement towards truth. And our desire to participate in something larger than our ego will grow here, those desires. And that sense that life is meaningful in our belonging to a wider reality. And that's a different kind of expansion than what's offered by hyperreality, because hyperreality often amplifies things without integration. So it gives us more and more and more, but often without helping us digest, contemplate, embody, or to truly be transformed by what we're consuming. And that's where Jupiter's shadow can come in. Because as Rem Butler points out in his book, partial or unintegrated contact with Jupiter can become inflation, excess, arrogance, and overreach. Think of our technology. I think it's really embodying all those shadows in some form or another. So that shadow of Jupiter is not just about indulgence, it's the confusion of largeness with truth. The bigger you are, the truer you are. The bigger your platform, the more truth you have to supply. It's the assumption that bigger is better. We have this parallel going around in our minds. It's expansion without proportion. So it's an appetite without wisdom, and it's amplification with no sort of grounding. And to me, that is describing a lot of our current world now. We're encouraged to think bigger, say more, scale, reach, consume more. We're always shown, I know as I started my online business, brand it more, optimize, perform, all of those things you're pressurized into doing, but very often it's not leading to a deepening of human life. It's actually leading to fragmentation. And I think that is so important, because the human soul is genuinely longing for expansion. We have that longing for growth and for understanding more of our world. And we long to belong, and often to something greater, and to feel that our lives mean something. And we're more often than not wanting to be lifted beyond narrowness. We want to touch the sacred or the beautiful or what is true. And that longing is real. But that longing is often met in distorted ways. And then we mistake stimulation for meaning, that scale for significance, and digital vastness for transcendence. And that is part of the sadness of this time, because so many people are surrounded by an enormous amount of mediated more, and yet inwardly they're feeling underfed. And that isn't because the need itself is wrong. Wanting more is definitely not wrong at all, but because the form in which it's being answered is not equal to the depth of the need. And to me, that is a Jupiterian wound. The longing to widen into life is real, but the culture often offers us a synthetic version of widening. So what does that look like? It looks like vast content, millions of opinion. You write one thing down in an active social media post, and you get a million opinions, with nobody knowing you at depth, and you not knowing those people at depth. So no kind of context for it. We've got a vastness of spectacle and noise, and definitely the data is so vast now, as is the digital reach. But this is not necessarily the kind of vastness that is truly going to change us, change our souls. Because real Jupiter is connected to awe, and awe is completely different from overwhelm, or enlarges us by placing us in relation to something greater. But as it does that, it humbles and deepens us. So it makes us feel both small and meaningful at the same time. And you can feel that or get that sense in nature. If you're sitting looking at the mountains, wow, you can sense that. And you can feel it under the vastness of a night sky, or looking at an ocean, the sea for the English here, the sea. And you can also feel that in deep study, or when you're praying and meditating. Art can bring that smallness and meaningfulness, and in a real moment of insight, in travel that actually changes you. Travel can confront and change us, but we can also feel it in a profound conversation, and within our rituals we can come in contact with it in shared silence and in an encounter with truth, or a truth that reorders your life. That's Jupiter. And it's not the same thing as being bombarded, because hyperreality often overwhelms rather than enlarge. There's an enlargement of information, but that doesn't mean yeah, it is. It's not the same thing. It's just not the same enlargement that we're looking at. It fills the field, colonizes our attention. It can keep us busy and reacting, scrolling, consuming, but it doesn't always deepen our participation in reality. Social media can often just be an echo chamber. There's like 1,000,001 comments and nobody actually interacts. They do sometimes, and it's often rudely when someone's triggered. That's what we're living in at the moment. And in fact, very often it's pulling us away from the conditions in which that deeper participation becomes possible. And that's because true growth requires time. We need to digest. We need that slowness and reflection. And true growth requires embodied experience and relationship, and the capacity to stay with something long enough for it to transform you. And that's where I believe embodiment becomes absolutely essential, because the body restores proportion. It reminds us that we're finite. I mean, I know that a lot now in my 60s. You've realised how finite you are. But just the actual body, if you look at it, there's a beginning and an end to it. The body reminds us of rhythms and cycles. We know about fatigue, hunger and vulnerability in our bodies, in that embodiment. And we know that there is time and waiting. And as I said, that there are seasons and cycles. And all of that is incredibly important in a world that increasingly tries to flatten experience into immediacy. Ask a question, get the answer. Go in Google, look for an image, get the answer. Okay, it's just like chomp, chomp, chomp. Okay, so it's a comparison. It's a difference. Embodied life slows us down enough to actually live, and relationship deepens that even further, because other people are not infinitely customizable. We can't customize people to our taste, not like AI and Chat GPT can customize all its replies to us in a way that just echoes your own way of thinking and feeling. If we're in real conversation, we have pauses, and a real relationship always includes misunderstanding. Our friendships require our effort, and a real community can be completely inconvenient. Just can. A real shared life includes friction, disappointment, repair, compromise, patience. And I actually think those things are part of what makes life meaningful, because we live in a culture that increasingly treats friction as something to eliminate. But I think friction is often one of the places where reality enters, the real resists us, and it can interrupt us. It always asks something of us, and the real has weight. And without that weight, we can drift into a very thin form of existence. And that existence can be one that is highly stimulated, but no depth to the form. It's not deeply formed. It can be highly networked and no depth of connection with anyone. It can be expressive, but then not deeply known, and highly informed, but without that deep wisdom. So when I think about Jupiter in relation to hyperreality, I don't simply think the answer is contraction or retreat or fear of technology. I think the answer is discernment. What kind of expansion are we participating in? We can know what we're participating in simply by asking, is what we're doing making us more whole and deep in our relation to truth? Is it increasing our generosity or widening our moral imagination? Is it humbling us before a larger whole and strengthening our capacity for relationship, for patience, for wonder, for reverence? Or is it just merely amplifying our appetite, performance, distraction, and abstraction? To me, that's the real question. Because technology can absolutely be useful. I use it all the time. It can connect, teach, support. It can reveal and help. I'm not interested in simplistic anti-technology positions, but I do think we have to become more honest about the forms of false transcendence that are being offered to us. And by false transcendence, I mean experiences that imitate expansion, but don't truly deepen us. So those are those experiences that feel vast, but leave us existentially starved. How many times do we go looking for those beautiful meditations or spiritual gurus that we consume masses of, but we're still existentially starving? Okay. Experience that can feel connective, but erode relationships. Again, sorry, you might not have heard that last one, that they erode our relationships. If we're, scrolling for 6 hours, what does that do to our partners or our children or those around us if we're addicted to the scrolling? And experiences that feel empowering but actually make us more passive. So we can consume lots of information, but if we're not digesting it, contemplating it, embodying it, we become more passive, and then we become more openly for manipulation there. And experiences that feel meaningful in the moment, but don't actually root us more deeply in life. This is why embodied, relational, shared human life matters so much. Because it's one of the few places where growth still has density. And it can be as simple as having a meal with another person or a walk with a friend. And that community gathering will bring that kind of density, as will a hard conversation. And study that changes your mind or broadens your intellect. We can also find that silence, ritual, and nature contain that density. And definitely shared grief and joy has density. These things enlarge us differently. But that's not by way of giving us endless more, but by bringing us into a richer contact with what is already here. And perhaps that's one of the most important Jupiterian lessons now, that true expansion is not always outward. Sometimes it's an inward widening, a deepening of our capacity to hold life. And that includes paradox and complexity. And that capacity to hold otherness and sorrow and joy together, or to hold the self in relation to a larger order. And that kind of enlargement doesn't happen usually with speed. It's often with practice, contemplation, as we do that through real life, through reality, lived experience, and through time. And I think this is why our culture feels so spiritually unstable at the moment, because we got so many mechanisms of amplification, but not enough containers, call it containers of meaning. We've got scale that isn't necessarily wisdom, visibility, but is that identity, visibility, is that the true person there? We've got connectivity, but it often lacks communion, endless expression, but not necessarily inner coherence. So perhaps the invitation of Jupiter now is not just to expand, but to ask what kind of expansion is worthy of our soul. So what is enlarging us without inflating us, or deepening us without isolating us? And what is there that broadens our perspective without dissolving our humanity? That is so important. And what can we do? What is it that restores awe rather than that production of overwhelm, which we can sometimes mistake for awe? And what is reconnecting us to the larger universe in a way that also makes us more ethical, relational, grounded, and more generous? Because I think integrated Jupiter does exactly that. It doesn't bypass humanity. It ennobles the human, the soul, by reconnecting us with something larger. Jupiter reminds us that growth is not just about accumulation, or abundance is not just how much you can consume. Jupiter teaches us that success is not just visibility, and knowledge is definitely not just about collecting information. Transcendence is not escape, and meaning is not content. Someone's got 1,000 videos up. It doesn't mean it contains meaning. I'm sure there's a lot of creators that have got 1,000 videos up and it's rich with meaning. But that meaning has to be lived and the truth has to be embodied. Wisdom, we need to digest, and that expansion that comes from that wisdom needs to be integrated. So if hyperreality is offering us that false vastness, then perhaps Jupiter is asking us to return to true vastness. And what is that? Well, simple, the vastness of the night sky or of consciousness. Delve into that, and there's a vastness there, that vastness of moral responsibility and love. And as you stand under that night sky, you can realize the vastness of being one finite creature within a living, mysterious cosmos. Those kinds of vastness, they don't fragment us, they gather us and give us humility, steady us and open us up at a heart level, a heart and mind level. And it reminds us that we're not simply here to consume experience, but to participate in life more fully, more consciously, more generously. So perhaps the work now is not to reject expansion, but to sanctify it. And the same with technology. We don't need to reject technology, but we need to put it back in right relationship to humanity, to people. And definitely don't reject your desire for more, but ask what kind of more is truly healing. So what is going to deepen our relationships and restore meaning? What kind of more will open our heart and return us to wonder and awe? Because that to me is the deepest promise of Jupiter, not endless enlargement for its own sake, but meaningful enlargement, that beautiful widening, opening up of our consciousness. And it brings with it a renewal, a generosity of heart, and a restoration of perspective, and that recovery of awe. And so important, it brings the movement of the soul towards a more inclusive, more truthful, more participatory relationship with the whole. That may be one of the most important spiritual tasks we have. So in a world of spectacle, speed, and endless mediated experience, maybe the task is not to reject expansion, but to reclaim it, to remember the difference between false vastness and true enlargement, between stimulation and awe and scale and wisdom, and between that endless access and genuine participation in life. Thank you for being here with me. If the reflection resonated for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially how you experience the difference between true expansion and false expansion in your own life. And if you'd like to keep exploring astrology, archetypes, and deeper reflections like this with me, do subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.